Celtic polytheism, commonly known as Celtic paganism, comprises the religious beliefs and practices adhered to by the Iron Age people of Western Europe, now known as the Celts, roughly between 500 BCE and 500 CE, spanning the Latine period and the Roman era, and in the case of the insular Celts, the British and Irish Iron Age. Celtic polytheism was one of a larger group of Iron Age polytheistic religions of the Indo-European family. It comprised a large degree of variation both geographically and chronologically, although, behind this variety, broad structural similarities can be detected, allowing there to be a basic religious homogeneity among the Celtic peoples. The Celtic pantheon consists of numerous recorded theorems, both from Greco-Roman ethnography and from epigraphy. Among the most prominent ones are Tutatis, Taranis and Lagus. Figures from medieval Irish mythology have also been adduced by comparative mythology, interpreted as euhemerized versions of pre-Christian insular deities. The most salient feature of Celtic religion as reflected in Roman historiography is their extensive practice of human sacrifice. According to Greek and Roman accounts, in Gaul, Britain and Ireland, there was a priestly caste of magico-religious specialists, known as the Druids, although very little is definitely known about them. Following the Roman Empire's conquest of Gaul and southern Britannia, Celtic religious practices began to display elements of Romanization, resulting in a syncretic Gallo-Roman culture with its own religious traditions, with its own large set of deities, such as Cernunnos, Artio, Telesphorus, etc. In the later 5th and the 6th centuries, the Celtic region was Christianized and earlier religious traditions were supplanted. However, the polytheistic traditions left a legacy in many of the Celtic nations, influenced later mythology, and served as the basis for a new religious movement, Celtic Neo-Paganism, in the 20th century. Deities. Celtic religion was polytheistic, believing in many deities, both gods and goddesses, some of which were venerated only in a small, local area, but others whose worship had a wider geographical distribution. The names of over 200 of these deities have survived to us today, although it is possible that some of these names were different titles or epithets used for the same deity. Common Celtic theorems. Some Celtic theorems can be established as pan-Celtic by comparing continental with insular Celtic evidence. An example of this is Gaulish Lagus, whose name is cognate with Irish Lugh and Welsh Lleu. Another example is Gaulish Brigantia, cognate with Irish Brigid. This latter theonym can even be reconstructed as a Proto-Indo-European epithet of the dawn goddess, as *bhrgnti, the one on high. Antiquity. Some of the Greek and Roman accounts mention various deities worshipped in Gaul. For instance, Lucan noted the names of Tutates, Taranis and Esus, although Julius Caesar instead conflated the Celtic Gaulish deities with those of Roman religion, and did not mention their native Gaulish names. He declared that the most widely venerated god in Gaul was Mercury, the Roman god of trade, but that they also worshipped Apollo, Minerva, Mars and Jupiter. According to classical-era sources, the Celts worshipped the forces of nature and did not envisage deities in anthropomorphic terms, as other pagan peoples such as the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians did. Whether or not this is true, as the classical peoples grew in influence over the Celtic cultures, it encouraged the depiction of deities in human forms, and they appear to move from a more animistic-based faith to a more Romanized polytheistic view. Several of these deities, including Lagus and Matronis, were triple deities. Insular mythology in the Irish and to a lesser extent Welsh vernacular sources from the Middle Ages. Various human mythological figures were featured who have been thought of by many scholars as being based upon earlier gods. The historian Ronald Hutton, however, cautioned against automatically equating all Irish and Welsh mythological figures as former deities, noting that while some characters, who appear to be human, such as Medb or Saint Briad, probably were indeed once regarded as divine. The warriors who are the main protagonists of the stories have the same status as those in the Greek myths, standing between the human and divine orders. To regard characters such as Acu Chularan, Fergus MacRoich or Conal Cernich as former gods turned into humans by a later storyteller is to misunderstand their literary and religious function. Acu Chularan is no more a former god than Superman is. Examining these Irish myths, Barry Cunliffe stated that he believed they displayed a dualism between the male tribal god and the female deity of the land, while Anne Ross felt that they displayed that the gods were, on the whole, intellectual, deeply versed in their native learning, poets and prophets, storytellers and craftsmen, magicians, healers, warriors, in short, equipped with every quality admired and desired by the Celtic peoples themselves. Insular Celts swore their oaths by their tribal gods, and the land, sea and sky, as in, I swear by the gods by whom my people swear, and, if I break my oath, may the land open to swallow me, the sea rise to drown me, and the sky fall upon me. Animistic Aspects. Some scholars, such as Prudence Jones and Nigel Pennick, have speculated that the Celts venerated certain trees, and others, such as Miranda Aldhouse Green, that the Celts were animists, believing that all aspects of the natural world contained spirits, and that communication was possible with these spirits. Places such as rocks, streams, mountains, and trees may all have had shrines or offerings devoted to a deity residing there. These would have been local deities, known and worshipped by inhabitants living near to the shrine itself, and not pan-Celtic like some of the polytheistic gods. The importance of trees in Celtic religion may be shown by the fact that the very name of the Eburonian tribe contains a reference to the yew tree, and that names like Macquilin and Macabar appear in Irish myths. In Ireland, wisdom was symbolized by the salmon who feed on the hazelnuts from the trees that surround the Well of Wisdom. Burial and afterlife. Celtic burial practices, which included burying food, weapons, and ornaments with the dead, suggest a belief in life after death. The Druids, the Celtic learned classes that included members of the clergy, were said by Caesar to have believed in reincarnation and transmigration of the soul, along with astronomy and the nature and power of the gods. A common factor in later mythologies from Christianized Celtic nations was the Underworld. This was the realm of the fairy folk and other supernatural beings, who would entice humans into their realm. Sometimes this other world was claimed to exist underground, while at other times it was said to lie far to the west. Several scholars have suggested that the other world was the Celtic afterlife, though there is no direct evidence to prove this. Cultic practice. Evidence suggests that among the Celts, offerings to the gods were made throughout the landscape, both the natural and the domestic. At times they worshipped in constructed temples and shrines, evidence for which have been unearthed across the Celtic world by archaeologists, although according to Greco-Roman accounts, they also worshipped in areas of the natural world that were held to be sacred, namely in groves of trees. Across Celtic Europe, many of the constructed temples, which were square in shape and constructed out of wood, were found in rectangular ditched enclosures known as Verechensen, where in cases such as Holzhausen in Bavaria votive offerings were also buried in deep shafts. However, in the British Isles, temples were more commonly circular in design. According to Barry Cunliffe, the monumentality of the Irish religious sites sets them apart from their British and continental European counterparts, with the most notable example being the Hill of Tara. However, according to Greco-Roman accounts of the Druids and other Celts, worship was held in groves, with Tacitus describing how his men cut down groves sacred to savage rites by their very nature. Such groves would not survive in the archaeological record, and so we have no direct evidence for them today. Alongside groves, certain springs were also viewed as sacred and used as places of worship in the Celtic world. Notable Gaulish examples include the sanctuary of Sequana at the source of the Seine in Burgundy and Chamalières near to Clermont-Ferrand. At both of these sites, a large array of votive offerings have been uncovered, most of which are wooden carvings, although some of which are embossed pieces of metal. In many cases, when the Roman Empire took control of Celtic lands, earlier Iron Age sacred sites were reused, with Roman temples being built on the same sites. Examples include Ely in Gloucestershire, Worth in Kent, Hayling Island in Hampshire, Vendôme Capelli in Was, Saint-Germain-le-Rocheux in Châtillon-sur-Seine and Schleidweiler in Trier. Votive offerings. The Celts made votive offerings to their deities, which were buried in the earth or thrown into rivers or bogs. According to Barry Cunliffe, in most cases, deposits were placed in the same places on numerous occasions, indicating continual usage over a period of time, perhaps on a seasonal basis or when a particular event, past or pending, demanded a propitiatory response. In particular, there was a trend to offer items associated with warfare in watery areas, evidence for which is found not only in the Celtic regions, but also in late Bronze Age societies and those outside of the Celtic area, namely Denmark. One of the most notable examples is the River Thames in southern England, where a number of items had been deposited, only to be discovered by archaeologists millennia later. Some of these, like the Battersea Shield, Wandsworth Shield and the Waterloo Helmet, would have been prestige goods that would have been labor-intensive to make and thereby probably expensive. Another example is at Llancerrig Bark in Anglesey, Wales, where offerings, primarily those related to battle, were thrown into the lake from a rocky outcrop in the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE. At times, jewelry and other high-prestige items that were not related to warfare were also deposited in a ritual context. At Niederzier in the Rhineland, for example, a post that excavators believed had religious significance had a bowl buried next to it in which was contained 45 coins, 2 torques and an armlet, all of which made out of gold, and similar deposits have been uncovered elsewhere in Celtic Europe. Human sacrifice. Greco-Roman writers stated that the Celts practiced human sacrifice in Gaul. Cicero, Julius Caesar, Suetonius, and Lucan all refer to it, and Pliny the Elder says that it occurred in Britain, too. It was forbidden under Tiberius and Claudius. However, it is possible that these claims may have been false, and used as a sort of propaganda to justify the Roman conquest of these territories. There are very few recorded archaeological discoveries that preserve evidence of human sacrifice, and thus most contemporary historians tend to regard human sacrifice as rare within Celtic cultures. However, there is also archaeological evidence from Western Europe that has been widely used to back up the idea that human sacrifice was performed by the Iron Age Celts. Mass graves found in a ritual context dating from this period have been unearthed in Gaul, at both Gournay-sur-Erendur and Ribemont-sur-Ancre in what was the region of the Belgae chiefdom. The excavator of these sites, Jean-Louis Bruno, interpreted them as areas of human sacrifice in devotion to a war god, although this view was criticized by another archaeologist, Martin Brown, who believed that the corpses might be those of honored warriors buried in this sanctuary rather than sacrifices. At a bog in Lindow, Cheshire, England was discovered a body, designated the Lindow Man, which may also have been the victim of a sacrificial ritual, but it is just as likely that he was an executed criminal or a victim of violent crime. The body is now on display at the British Museum, London. In Ireland, similar discoveries in 2003 of 2 murdered individuals preserved in separate bogs, each subsequently dated to around 100 BCE, lends some credence to the ritual murder theory. Headhunting. The iconography of the human head is believed by many archaeologists and historians to have played a significant part in Celtic religion. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, described how Celtic warriors cut off the heads of enemies slain in battle and attached them to the necks of their horses. Strabo meanwhile commented, in the same century, that until the Roman authorities put a stop to it, among the Celts, the heads of enemies held in high repute they used to embalm in cedar oil and exhibit to strangers, archaeological evidence indicating that the Celts did indeed behead humans and then display their heads, possibly for religious purposes, has been unearthed at a number of excavations. One notable example of this was found at the Gaulish site of Intremont near to Aix-en-Provence, where a fragment of a pillar carved with images of skulls was found, within which were niches where actual human skulls were kept, nailed into position, 15 examples of which were found. The archaeologist Barry Cunliffe believed that the Celts held reverence for the power of the head, and that to own and display a distinguished head was to retain and control the power of the dead person, while the archaeologist Anne Ross asserted that the Celts venerated the head as a symbol of divinity and the powers of the other world, and regarded it as the most important bodily member, the very seat of the soul. The archaeologist Miranda Green meanwhile stated that, "I refute any suggestion that the head itself was worshipped, but it was clearly venerated as the most significant element in a human or divine image representing the whole." The historian Ronald Hutton, however, criticized the idea of the cult of the human head, believing that both the literary and archaeological evidence did not warrant this conclusion, noting that the frequency with which human heads appears upon Celtic metalwork proves nothing more than they were a favorite decorative motif among several, and one just as popular among non-Celtic peoples, priesthood Druids. According to a number of Greco-Roman writers such as Julius Caesar, Cicero, Tacitus and Pliny the Elder, Gaulish and British society held a group of magico-religious specialists known as the Druids in high esteem. Their roles and responsibilities differed somewhat between the different accounts, but Caesar's, which was the fullest and earliest original text to describe the Druids, described them as being concerned with divine worship, the due performance of sacrifices, private or public, and the interpretation of ritual questions. He also claimed that they were responsible for officiating at human sacrifices, such as the Wicker Man burnings. Nonetheless, a number of historians have criticized these such accounts, believing them to be biased or inaccurate. Vernacular Irish sources also referred to the Druids, portraying them not only as priests but as sorcerers who had supernatural powers that they used for cursing and divination and who opposed the coming of Christianity. Various historians and archaeologists have interpreted the Druids in different ways. Peter Berry's Fidelis, for instance, believed them to be the equivalents of the Indian Brahmin caste, while Anne Ross believed that they were essentially tribal priests, having more in common with the shamans of tribal societies than with the classical philosophers. Ronald Hutton meanwhile held a particularly skeptical attitude to many claims made about them, and he supported the view that the evidence available was of such a suspicious nature that we can know virtually nothing of certainty about the ancient Druids, so that, although they certainly existed, they function more or less as legendary figures. Poets in Ireland. The Fili were visionary poets, associated with law-keeping, verse-craft, and the memorization of vast numbers of poems. They were also magicians, as Irish magic is intrinsically connected to poetry, and the satire of a gifted poet was a serious curse upon the one being satirized. To run afoul of a poet was a dangerous thing indeed to a people who valued reputation and honor more than life itself. In Ireland, a bard was considered a lesser grade of poet than a Fili, more of a minstrel and rote reciter than an inspired artist with magical powers. However, in Wales, bard was the word for the visionary poets, and used in the same manner Fili was in Ireland and Scotland. The Celtic poets, of whatever grade, were composers of eulogy and satire, and a chief duty was that of composing and reciting verses on heroes and their deeds, and memorizing the genealogies of their patrons. It was essential to their livelihood that they increased the fame of their patrons, via tales, poems and songs. As early as the 1st century CE, the Latin author Lucan referred to bards as the national poets or minstrels of Gaul and Britain. In Gaul the institution gradually disappeared, whereas in Ireland and Wales it survived. The Irish bard through chanting preserved a tradition of poetic eulogy. In Wales, where the word bard has always been used for poet, the bardic order was codified into distinct grades in the 10th century. Despite her decline of the order toward the end of the European Middle Ages, the Welsh tradition has persisted and is celebrated in the annual Eisteddfod, a national assembly of poets and musicians. Calendar. The oldest attested Celtic calendar is the Colini calendar, dated to the 2nd century and as such firmly within the Gallo-Roman period. Some feast days of the medieval Irish calendar have sometimes been speculated to descend from prehistoric festivals, especially by comparison to terms found in the Colini calendar. This concerns Beltane in particular, which is attributed ancient origin by medieval Irish writers. The festivals of Samhain and Imbolc are not associated with paganism or Druidry in Irish legend, but there have nevertheless been suggestions of a prehistoric background since the 19th century. In the case of Samhain by John Rhys and James Fraser, who assumed that this festival marked the Celtic New Year.